We begin tonight with the steadily progressing impeachment investigation of the President of the United States and the President's stunning decision to refuse to defend himself, a decision no other president under investigation has ever made, the decision to simply not defend himself. Now, if you were under investigation and you had information to prove your innocence, would you withhold that information? Would you not allow witnesses to testify who could help prove your innocence? That's what Donald Trump wants you to believe. He wants you to believe that he is innocent and that he is withholding evidence and blocking witnesses who could prove that he is innocent. All you have to do is say that out loud to hear how ridiculous that idea is. But it means that so far, the President of the United States is refusing to have his lawyers participate in the first official impeachment hearing in the House Judiciary Committee this week. That strategy could easily change at any time. The president's lawyers will always be allowed to participate in the Judiciary Committee's impeachment hearings. The rules of the impeachment investigation allow for the full participation by the president's lawyers in the Judiciary Committee. And so far, the president's lawyers have nothing to say. They have no defense. The first hearing in the Judiciary Committee on Wednesday will be a largely academic one with 4 law professors, including one selected by the Republicans on the committee, offering their views on the impeachment process as described in the Constitution and as established by centuries of congressional precedent. As Chairman Adam Schiff described to Rachel Maddow in the last hour, the House Intelligence Committee had access tonight to review Chairman Schiff's report of the committee's findings concerning President Trump's request to the president of Ukraine to investigate Joe Biden. Chairman Schiff told Rachel that the report will become public sometime tomorrow, and the Intelligence Committee will meet at the end of the day tomorrow at 6 p.m. to vote on approving the report and then sending it to the House Judiciary Committee, where it can then be considered as the basis for possible articles of impeachment. The House leadership announced tonight that they would keep the House of Representatives in session an additional week in December. That means that the House of Representatives will not recess for the Christmas holiday until as late as December 20th. And that might mean that the House Judiciary Committee will use the first 3 weeks of December to bring articles of impeachment to a vote in the House Judiciary Committee. Leading off our discussion tonight, Jill Wine-Banks, former Assistant Watergate Special Prosecutor and an MSNBC legal analyst, and John Heilemann, National Affairs Analyst for NBC News and MSNBC. He is the Editor-in-Chief of The Recount. John, we just heard from Chairman Schiff in the last hour saying the report is ready, it is written, it's ready to go. It'll be released tomorrow. We'll all have it at this hour tomorrow night. The Democrats are moving with all deliberate speed, exactly as Nancy Pelosi said they would at the beginning of this process.
Let's be clear, Lawrence. I think what we have learned over the course of the last year, but specifically in the last 2 months, is that the 2 crucial players in the House of Representatives on this matter are Nancy Pelosi and Adam Schiff, both of whom made a political judgment for a long time that they did not want to proceed with impeachment until it became absolutely necessary for a matter related to questions of precedent, for questions of what they would allow to stand, and because they thought the politics were tolerable to go forward. But they are still calling the tune. And this big question that has hovered over once we get through Thanksgiving, which was, and I don't think there was ever much of a question because Nancy Pelosi and Adam Schiff were clear on it, was would they let this thing drag? Would they give up all deliberate speed? Would they try to pursue through the courts getting John Bolton and other witnesses to come in? It was clear. I think for weeks it's been clear that they would not do that they will have this vote done by Christmas, and they are still sticking to that throughout. And if you want to see what's going to happen over the course of these next few weeks, watch those 2.
We have something that Chairman Schiff said in the last hour. I think the control room has it ready about where they are in this investigation and why they are not going to wait around at this point to gather more evidence. Let's see if we have that.
You get to a point in an investigation where you can tell it is going to be a long time before you get the next valuable increment of information.
Jill Wine-Banks, I assume you've been there as a prosecutor where you have a case You know there's more evidence to be gathered, but you're looking at the calendar, you're looking at how long it will take, you're looking at other factors, and you say, let's make our move now.
Absolutely. I started as an organized crime prosecutor. I could have investigated for the rest of my life any one of the crime families, and I would have kept getting bad information every single day. But at some point you say enough is sufficient. I have enough to make a case, and it's important that I take these people out of circulation, and I have to act now. And I think that was a very wise choice on the part of the House right now. And I would also say that although there is obviously a lot more that could be gained by the witnesses who have refused to testify, and I believe the courts will say they have to testify, in the meantime, it is perfectly legitimate. People in their everyday lives do this, and courts allow it. You can say, you can draw an adverse inference from the fact that they have failed to come forward. And that's enough. Between all the evidence that we have and the adverse inference from the fact that they have not brought forward anyone, if the president had something that would exculpate him, he would have presented that evidence. There is none. That's the problem.
Let's listen to what California Republican Congressman Tom McClintock said about the president not participating in the Judiciary Committee hearing.
I think it would be to the president's advantage to have his attorneys there. That is his right. But I can also understand how he is upset at the illegitimate process that we saw unfold in the Intelligence Committee.
So you think they should bring in lawyers?
I think it's to his advantage, yes.
And, John, the reason I showed that is Tom McClintock is one of those formally reasonable conservative Republican members of Congress. And you can get to a point in this discussion with him where he has to admit, yes, there's something a little strange about not defending yourself.
Of course, something more than a little strange. There's something completely unprecedented, as you pointed out earlier. And it's in some sense strange and not strange. Not strange in the sense that if there was a case to be made on the facts, not only would the lawyers be present, but these other witnesses who we were just discussing, the Boltons of the world, the Mulvaney's of the world, the Pompeos of the world would be coming forward. The president would free all the fact witnesses to come forward if they had facts that would help exculpate him. He does not. And so in some sense, it's really strange. And on another level, it's the most rational thing the president's doing.
Jill, this reminds me of what I used to hear criminal defense lawyers say when I was hanging around courthouses in an earlier life. When they'd had somebody who was, let's just say, a very difficult defendant to represent. And the question they'd all ask each other is, can you put your guy on the stand? And when they couldn't put their defendant on the stand, it meant that really there wasn't a very strong defense to be made from the witness stand. And this kind of feels like that. This feels like one of those cases where it's like, well, what defense do you expect us to present? We don't really have one. So the president is making a lot of noise about the process, attacking the process and claiming there's no point in offering a defense in this process. But what defense would there be to offer?
There is no defense. And what they have said in the minority report, which is completely outrageous, is they just simply say there is no evidence to support the accusations. But they don't present any evidence that says there is a defense to those. And it's sort of like if I went into a bank and I wrote a check on my own bank account and cashed the check, and then I pulled out a gun and said to the teller, and now give me all the money in the vault. The fact that I did a legal transaction by withdrawing from my own account does not legalize the fact that I pulled out a gun and robbed the bank. And the same thing is true right now in terms of this. They're saying, well, the president was concerned about Ukraine's corruption. Well, if he was, he never let anybody know. But even if he was, it wouldn't excuse the fact that he withheld the money and put in danger our national security and that of Ukraine, an ally, by doing that. And he helped only one person, himself and Putin. So I guess he helped two people. It's not just one. And that makes it illegal. It makes it criminal. And people have to understand the danger that this poses to our democracy and to the 2020 election. And that even though the election is less than a year away, we can't wait that long. We need to protect our election. And I think, unfortunately, he has pushed into the Democratic Party to the point where they had no choice but to bring impeachment.
Jill Wine-Banks, John Howman, thank you both for starting us off tonight. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.